I mean, like, I'd like to maybe talk about something that finds its way into a lot of your work. I mean, mostly kind of your novels, but some of your poems as well. Apart from just science and history, painting seems to come up quite a lot in your work. Not just the paintings of like mentioned the 49 gallery, but also in your fiction there are characters who are themselves painters, such as Warhol and de Kooning, but there are others who are kind of part of, I suppose, a Dan Schneider painterly pantheon where you meet like Andrew Wyeth pops up in a few plays and in novels here and there, and it almost feels that kind of like you kind of use painting as an excuse to kind of like get into like kind of like these manifesto moments. I mean, like you've mentioned that painting by Wyeth. Is it Sophie's Dream or Sophie's World? Christina's World. Yes. And you talk about that as a perfect way for like the artist to go out there and not to sort of just retreat into sort of more and more refined abstractions, to actually work the abstractions into a larger whole and for it to relate to some kind of human experience. Like you talk about there being all sorts of things you can read into Christina's World and all this sort of. Could you talk more about your relationship with kind of Wyeth, I suppose, or painting as a whole? I mean, does your mind often go to paintings when you're kind of thinking about your work?
In the mid 1990s, there's a book company called Taschen from Germany, and they had these soft cover books. They had maybe 30 or 40 of them, and they'd have all the great artists and whatnot. And I would take, with my bad eyesight, I would take my little magnifier here, if you can see it, and I'd look over the painting and see the detail on it. Now, some people will say that you can't get the total things. I mean, if you see a Van Gogh and you see the way the blobs rise off the page and what, yes, there's a slight 3D element, but pretty much you can get from reproductions the whole grasp of the painting. Someone like Wyeth is interesting because he was so slagged upon. He's so much better than Pollock or de Kooning. Oh, I want to paint a whole canvas orange. Ain't that genius?
Yeah.
But take a look. I forget the name of it, but there's a painting where you see a tree, you see a limb, you see the carcass of a deer hanging from it, and you see a shed. Someone has probably just left, or maybe whatnot. It's drying. It's jerkifying out in the fresh air, and that's all you see. That brings to mind someone like Vermeer. It brings back to mind someone like Edward Hopper. These painters that get a moment, and it's a very human moment. In Christina's World, I've talked about how if you split that into quadrants, the lower right quadrant could be an abstract painting. It's just the grass, the dried brown and yellow grass, and yet then you peel back and you get the whole thing. There's something deeper. This shows to me the art of how intellectually barren something like abstract expressionism is. I just saw a day or two ago a video from something called Vox, V-O-X, Vox, and they were talking about is Jackson Pollock overrated? Well, their conclusion was that he might be overrated, but who cares? They were saying, well, he was overrated, but he's still a good artist, basically, because Clement Greenberg, the critic who sort of bruited him.
Clement Greenberg didn't even really like Pollock, but he kind of like gave up on him halfway through.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, what intellectual content is that? If you actually look at Pollock's early work, there's a very famous painter who's known and derided as a mediocre painter, whose work is so strikingly similar to the early Jackson Pollock, and that painter was named Adolf Hitler. If you look at Adolf Hitler's early stuff or all of his paintings, they're competent. Hitler wasn't a bad painter, but he had no ideas. He was just painted things. Pollock just paints things. It's like writers who just write words. And what I mean by that is there's nothing there of any depth. if you can read a poem, you can read a play, you can read an essay, you can read my novels, you can read my short stories. You can say there's something there. 1,000 years from now, whether it's future humans or creatures we meet that are sentient, that are engaged in our art, they'll say there's something there. I understand. I can feel the mind at work. It's like if you look at something there's only 3 or 4 moments in something like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the Gawain poet they call him.
The really old book.
Yeah. The original. There's 3 or 4 moments that really get that, which is good for something 1,000 or more years old. But that's the point. There was something breathing there. You read Jonathan Franzen, it's utterly generic.
Yeah.
One of the hallmarks of greatness in anything, especially the arts, though, is that it's not generic. You cannot mistake Walt Whitman's poetry for Wallace Stevens's. You cannot mistake Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who is probably the greatest female poet of the 19th century. She's way better than Emily Dickinson. Read Aurora Leigh. It's the greatest novel in verse written. Now you can say maybe it's not a great novel and maybe it's not a great poem, but putting those two together, it's a work of imagination. She's so much better than her husband. Robert Browning is a dry fart. Emily Dickinson was not better than Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Oh, she only wrote sonnets for the Portuguese. No, she didn't, you assholes. Actually read.
So you think? So you really think Elizabeth Barrett Browning is better than Emily Dickinson?
Oh yes, yes.
Really?
Aurora Leigh in of itself is a greater work of art than all of Dickinson's poetry.
All right.
Dickinson had. Yeah, there are some artists that have only 1 or 2 things that they can do. Think of Franz Kafka. All of his stories are the same. There's 2 or 3 that are really great: The Metamorphosis, The Trial, and arguably The Castle. Hunger artists. Think of Hermann Hesse. My wife has said, for example, he's got 5 or 6 great books, but Demian, his first great book, my wife has read more of him than I had. She said it's just Demian. There's like 5 or 6 shitty versions of Demian that he wrote and whatnot.